All right, while we're waiting for the questions, Jason, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself as well as just give us an overview of Civic and how a user profile would look in Civic and how one could add source suggestions in Civic as well?
Sure, Shruti. Hi, everybody. My name's Jason Sleba. I'm an editor at Civic. And so to start off, I will show you guys about what basically to how we start to log in, which I'll sign out real quick to do that. So just if you go to the CivicDB homepage, civicdb.org, you have to sign in, sign up, and you can sign in with any one of
Jason, you have to share your screen.
Oh, sorry about that. Thought it was working. There we go. All right. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
All right.
If you could go back to civicdb.org and just show us how that would, yeah, thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna go to the homepage at civicdb.org. I'm gonna go up to the sign in. You can sign in with any one of our providers. For me, it's Google. And once you get in, you'll get it back to the homepage, look the exact same thing, but it's now in the upper right corner. There's a tab that has your username and also a tab for all of your mentions and subscribed events. So you go to you click on your name and you'll then go to your actual profile, which your profile will include what your role is, anywhere from curator, editor, and administrator, through your username, any organizations you're affiliated with that I'll get to in a second. And then you have a biography, and then we have badges. So the badges kind of go through and you get badges as rewards for doing things within the Civic database, whether it's revising evidence that's in Civic already, whether it's additions of specific diseases, whether it's differences with flagging, where we would flag different, if we see a problem or some kind of inaccuracy within the database that would draw attention to the any other curators and editors within the Civic community. There's multiple different badges that we have that as a way of incentivizing activity within the database. And then also in your profile, all the submitted evidence items that you've done would be tracked as well. And then your user activity. So not just this part up here is submitted evidence items, but then your user activity, whether it's just making a comment, making a suggested change, going through and rejecting, or basically anything you do within the Civic database is all tracked, which is we find it very important. This is a community database resource, but we want to track this stuff for data provenance. So one of the things I mentioned is that people can be part of multiple different organizations, and especially within ClinGen, we house multiple organizations in ClinGen. We house their curations. So if you go to the community tab and go to organizations, you can see that there are a variety of different organizations within Civic. In this case, I'm going to pick the Pediatric Cancer Task Force. That's part of ClinGen. It's within the somatic one of the somatic task forces. Now, within the organization page, you can go scroll through and see the members that are part of the task force. And kind of similar to the user page, we track organization statistics, whether how many comments, revisions, sources, and submitted evidence that we have, and accepted evidence from that specific organization. And then we also can track any submitted evidence items from that organization as well. And then also any organization user activity, which is very helpful as far as with these specific organizations, when you have their co-chairs and also the members to try to track and find, okay, what is being currently active within that community, for those to kind of go back and forth and communicate through and view those submissions and communicate about those submissions.
Jason, can you elaborate a little on the three roles that we're seeing here in this table: curator, editor, and admin?
Sure. So within the curator is what everybody starts out with within Civic. It's the basic level that everybody would be. So a curator is responsible for going through, looking for different papers and information from that specific paper, and then entering it as an evidence ID within Civic. They can go through and they can edit other users' evidence that's in there as well, and make comments, and also create source suggestions. An editor is somebody that has a specific number of submissions already within Civic. They also have usually advanced degrees within usually within the biology community. And as far as the editor goes, when an editor then goes through a specific set of specialized training with other editors in order to prepare themselves for that particular role, what the biggest thing with the difference between an editor and a curator is an editor can go through and actually accept evidence, whereas a curator can only enter evidence into Civic. And the idea behind that is the editor is going to go through and look at specific evidence that's entered in. They're going to check and verify the information that the curators added from the particular paper and verify that it's correct. And then they have the option of making edits, or they can also, or they can accept the evidence as is and then change it from basically the orange submitted status to the green accepted status within Civic. And an admin is just an extra step up from an editor where they can go kind of to the back end of Civic and make certain modifications and help kind of move certain evidence items or make like small corrections within the database on the back end. But for the most part, most of the people within Civic are curators or editors. So from this community part, what I was talking about too is that the idea is that like we're within Civic. Civic's a very community collaboration driven database where communication is key. And so one of the things that you can, when I tell you that there's editors and curators that kind of work together in order to get evidence submitted and accepted status within the database, we are able to show we're able to track all of that information within Civic so that anybody can go back and look at any date and time at any point from Civic starting 5 years ago all the way up until now. All this information is tracked within the database. So in this particular evidence item 7997, we can scroll down and we can just see that the evidence summary is here from the initial submission that was done 11 months ago by one of our curators. It was gone through, and then if you go click on the evidence talk tab, we can then log to see if there are any revisions that were made. And so there was a revision that was done 10 months ago where the specific disease was made more accurate into PH-like ALL. Then I went through 4 months ago and I made a revision to the evidence statement, and that particular revision is tracked where we can see what was changed from the original, where the red is taken out and the green is the modifications, and we get the resulting edits below. And then there's also ways to comment on these things where I commented on what I did and why I thought these certain changes should be made. And then I also commented that this particular change should be closed. And I basically came up with a better way of saying what describing this evidence, and I submitted another revision. And with this revision I made it also a change to the rating. And then another editor came in and made a comment on my revision, suggesting some other things that should be added or removed. And from that, another edit was created, and this one was modified some of the statement a little bit more. And there was another comment saying that they agreed with this. And then ultimately now this is what is the evidence statement. So the evidence statement changed, and the evidence, i.e. the evidence, overall evidence can change as the community, whether it's curators or editors, can go through and make these suggestions, and then the editors go back through and verify the information and ultimately decide that that's the, that this makes it accurate and makes it more clear to our users. The other function within the evidence items is that not just through revisions can we communicate and talk, but there's also within the evidence talk section, like in this particular EID, there are comments that are back and forth. So the original curator or editor put in their comment about what they thought about this particular EID. And then one of the other editors, RPod, put in their comment about how they thought this particular EID would fit or didn't fit within the Civic framework. So there's ways to communicate back and forth, and we can mention, and we can also use things like @mentions, where I can type in different users and make a comment within the database and then send it off to them, and then it will come up for them. And it will ultimately come up in their mentions, which you can look at up here. So all of your mentions are then tracked, so you can send direct messages through within the Civic interface to different users.
Jason, so at this point, there's actually there's a couple of really good questions. One is there a limit to the number of genes the curators can submit?
Oh, no, there's no limit. There's no limit to the amount of genes or evidence items. I mean, you can submit as many as you possibly can. So we encourage this, like anything to any, there's no limit to that at all, as long as the particular evidence being submitted into Civic has a clinical application towards cancer and cancer variants. That's the only limitation behind it, but you can submit as many things as you want to into the database.
Great. And another question is, how does one make an edit to the evidence item that was submitted before and say now there's, you know, new information about that evidence item, about that particular gene and its association with the disease? So could you show us how a user could, or how a curator could edit an evidence item?
Sure. So let's go back to the 7997 evidence item that we talked about. And let's click up here. There's this little pencil button up next to the evidence, next to this flag. You click on the edit evidence and you go through and you have the variant origin, the source type, PubMed ID, all these different things. So for some reason, like let's just say in this case, the disease was, we found that there was a new disease ontology out there that like clarified this, that made it more specific. We go through the disease and type in that specific disease and change that. We can go through the evidence statement and we could make certain edits to the evidence statement. Just whether it's like correcting a misspelling or correcting or adding in additional information from the paper. We could also go through, and if the evidence type was misinformed, we can change the evidence type from diagnostic to a more accurate evidence type if that would need be. But that's basically how we'd go through. And then at the end of all of this, what the most important thing is for any curator or editor going through this is we have a revision description where we really like curators and editors to type in the exact reason why they're making that change. Like whether they saw, oh, we saw this, this new piece of information came from figure 5, or this came from the supplementary material, this clarification came from this particular part. Giving the direction, or this is what, or talking through your actual thinking about why you think this change is helpful, helps the community, but also then will help an editor that's going through to confirm what your thought process is and why that actual change should be made. So the revision description is very important. So once all that stuff is added and edited in, you would then go down and you would submit that particular revision.
Thanks. And then one more related question is, how does Civic ensure that the curations are up to date?
So in that case, it's up to all the community to make sure they're up to date. So we have the idea of the submitted status versus the accepted status. So being that all these things are published papers, and the idea is that once they're published and they're peer-reviewed published papers, that their data we're taking through is the up-to-date version from that time and that snapshot when it was published. But as far as the other thing, it's up to the curation community to kind of put these things through up to date. So we have the different ClinGen task forces that go through and they try to look for new data, new genes, new information that's going through like their focuses to try to say, okay, we really need to step up our curation on JAK2 fusions, or we really need to focus on FLT3 mutations, like for example. Or there are different things where when the FDA comes out with new recommendations, or the NCCN guidelines are updated, we kind of look through those to try to find what the new particular things are within the clinical community that's driving different treatment options or different diagnostic options. And so we want to have that information within Civic. So the task forces are big help in looking at that. And it's also just the community in general, what your interest is. It's trying to find, okay, these are the new papers, this is what's going on. But it's really up to our curation community to make sure we're getting in that new information into Civic.
And I'd just like to add to that, that's one of our goals within the ClinGen Somatic Cancer Working Group as well. We do, as you had seen in the slides at the beginning of this session, we focus on different genes that are of interest to the community. And we basically take ownership of those genes to make sure that the curations are up to date, the curations are accurate, by discussing with different experts who are part of of our different disease task forces. And right now, we're focused on pediatric cancers, hematological cancers, as well as genitourinary cancers. And we have a variant curation expert panel for NTRK, which is in its first step. So the genes and the variants that are prioritized by our ClinGen Somatic task forces, our task force members would make sure that those curations are accurate as well as up to date. And then one other question, Jason, was how does Civic ensure that the curations are correct? And we had
That's
briefly talked about the editorial process in Civic, but Jason, if that's one of the things, if you want to go over or show us.
so with the idea of that, it's basically up to the, again, the editorial and the curation community to go through. So when something's submitted from a particular paper, I, as an editor, go through and I read that exact paper from that evidence ID, and I go through it thoroughly, through every figure, through every supplementary figure, and whatever is entered in from the actual paper. I make sure that, okay, those numbers are correct, the percentages were correct. The way the authors were interpreting that is also the way the curator interpreted it within the evidence statement. So it's up to the editor. That's why when we're talking about, when you have the curators go through specific training, but then when the editors go through the actual training too, the editors really go through much more intense training in the idea of how to pick out the evidence and how to really think about the evidence to make sure we're representing what the authors intended from that particular piece.
All right, and then another question is, does Civic use clinical or unpublished data?
There's no unpublished data that's within Civic. Everything that's within Civic is actually to be entered in from a peer-reviewed source, whether that's contained in PubMed or in the other peer-reviewed source that we use are ASCO abstracts. So those are the only two sources that we allow for submission of data into Civic.
Great. And how about preprint?
No, basically it's just the only two things are PubMed sources and the ASCO abstracts. Right now, those are the only two things we support.
Yeah, and so we just so like Jason showed in the evidence item submission form, Civic only accepts PubMed IDs or ASCO abstract IDs as source suggestions, or as as source suggestions. And so since preprints don't really get a PubMed ID, we were not able to use them at the time, at the moment, as a source for the evidence item. Yeah.
Oh, that would be a bit of a change to the data model, since we also focus on the PubMed IDs are peer reviewed. ASCO abstracts also go through a level of review before acceptance. So that's kind of baked into the model right now.
Great. All right, I see no other questions. So I think what we could do is move on to another feature in Civic that we had briefly talked about in the slides, and this is the variant assertion. So what Jason showed you was adding evidence items to Civic, and this is from a single PubMed ID from a PubMed, a published paper. But we are able to consolidate all of those evidence items for a particular variant within the context of a disease, and consolidate them into a variant assertion in Civic, and classify those based on the AMP, ASCO, and CAP guidelines. So we do have some slides on that as well. And Arpad, who is another editor with Civic, can describe that briefly.
Sounds good. I'll get started. And so what is our timeline? We're here in this room until 10, or until the next hour? Okay.
Yeah. So I think we could spend 5 more minutes to look at that, and then we'll see some other questions.
Good. I'll just do a quick. I'll just share the desktop, and then so people can see this.
Yes.
So I thought I'd quickly start. From what I understood, many people here might have a germline background, so I thought I'd start with something that might be known to some in the germline area. There is this published set of guidelines using a set of codes for assessing a germline variant and its potential deleterious nature, going from assigning codes to the germline variant based on, say, if it's a deleterious mutation that gets a strong code, down to weaker codes, say, that come from computer modeling shows that this variant may be deleterious. And then you sum these codes together to get an ultimate assessment of a variant's pathogenicity. You get, you sum together codes, and I'm going to say what this is in a second, but so you sum together these codes and you get an assessment of whether this variant is, pathogenic or likely pathogenic. Generally, if you have a bunch of really strong codes, you say, okay, well, it's pathogenic, or maybe very strong codes, you get likely pathogenic. Sometimes you get codes telling you it's benign, and then otherwise many live in this unknown significance space. And so Civic actually allows you to do this sort of a summing up and through the evidence, since since different papers will likely give you different insights into a variant, whether it's say the mutation is someone's been able to show that this mutation is non-functional, and there's maybe another paper describing a computer simulation that shows the mutation is non-functional. You can sum all this stuff together and come to evaluation. So that's kind of a bit of a background. I'm going to show, since this is somatic focused, how we do it in Civic. So there was published a few years ago now, was the AMP guidelines, which have been mentioned before. And it's kind of a way of also assessing the pathogenicity, but in this case, we're really talking about clinical actionability of variants, right? So we have variants of unknown clinical significance would be a tier 3. But if we have now clinical evidence for a variant having some sort of a prognostic or a diagnostic or a predictive value in cancer treatment, for instance, say that this variant is has been shown to be sensitizing to a specific drug in a specific cancer type. That's kind of how you think about, instead of pathogenic, you think about clinical actionability, right? And that's going to be a tier 1 type of variant, especially if this actionability has been described in guidelines. And then you have the tier 2 types of variants where you're doing various things like off-label study, where you say, okay, well, in one cancer type, this variant has been shown to be sensitive to a certain drug. I see this variant now in a different cancer type. I'm going to try to treat it there. That's an off-label use. Also, there's preclinical use, running cell lines and testing variants against different drugs, and you see some results there. That's preclinical evidence. If you see a drug kills a cell line with a certain variant in it, but then you take the variant out and the cell line isn't dying, that's going to be evidence for sort of a potential targeted use for that drug that you're going to want to try in higher up levels of studies, like case studies and eventually clinical trials. And then sometimes, there are passenger mutations. And so if you can show a variant as a passenger, then it becomes sort of benign in that regard. It's not going to show you any clinically actionable value in cancer. So this is kind of how this tiering system works. And this is what we build assertions around in Civic. And I think this has been mentioned already, but so in Civic, of course, we have evidence items, and those evidence items come from literature. And let me just click over to Civic and we'll take a look at this. But we sum together a bunch of knowledge from our evidence items for a specific variant to create an assertion. And then that assertion is assigned one of these tiers here. So let's just jump into the Civic interface real quick for 2 minutes. Let's put in my favorite gene, or one of my favorite genes, EGFR. And so we come to the Civic page here, where at the top we have a page describing some basic EGFR information. This has been curated by Civic curators as well. This stuff's been pulled in procedurally from various other databases. We have a list now here of our EGFR variants. Maybe we'll go to a favorite variant like L858R, which is here. If you're looking for a specific variant, you could also go L8, and you see how it keeps narrowing down, L858R, but I already knew what it was. It's right here. So I click that. That brings me down, as you know, down to the bottom of this page here, L858R with the variant description, some other, all of this has been curated by curators, and some coordinate information. And then we have a list now of the evidence items associated with this variant. And these are, each of these come from either publication or PubMed ASCO abstract. So you notice an evidence item is going to be, this comes from a certain paper. Here's the paper. There's a quick description of what this paper said. This looks like this was coming from a clinical trial. that showed there was no difference in regression-free survival between those treated with gefitinib or erlotinib. This is an interesting type of evidence item. It's showing that both, looks like we have 5 minutes left. So
yeah, so
okay.
can you go into an assertion, Arpad?
Yeah, it shows, yeah, exactly, because we have the assertion right here that this type of a thing supports, that this evidence item supports. I'm going to click over to there, and that brings us to an assertion for a predictive assertion supporting sensitivity to both gefitinib or erlotinib as substitutes in this case. Here we describe the L858R. It's a common EGFR mutation in non-small cell lung cancer. And in that, again, this the lung cancer patients with this mutation are likely going to be sensitive to gefitinib or erlotinib. It's a tier 1 level A. That means that this knowledge is in guidelines. If you read the guidelines, they'll say, look for this mutation. If you find this mutation in lung cancer, treat with this drug. Here we have down here the supporting evidence items. Remember, each of these comes from a literature source, whereas this up here is now a summary level, summarizing all of this literature down here. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So there was a question about what is the best way to get started. And so there's a few options here. If you'd like to explore the Civic database, it's an open access database. And so you could just go to civicdb.org and you can take a look at all of the data. You can also go ahead and create your user account based on how Jason showed you. So you could use your Google, your org ID, or your GitHub account to just log into Civic. If you are interested in joining the ClinGen Somatic Cancer Clinical Domain Working Group, please do fill out our volunteer survey. I'm going to add the link in the chat box here for everyone. Oh, sorry, that's... Yep, I've added the link right now. So here you can fill out our volunteer survey and indicate that you're interested in joining the ClinGen Somatic Cancer Working Group. And we will do another training for all of our new members and assign you to the different curation activities based on your interest as well. You could also, for further questions, get in touch with me. And I'm going to add my email address in the chat box as well. All right. I guess with that,
if we have a little bit of time,
Yeah.
I just had a question on Civic about the organizations. So how does Civic arrange their organizations? Is it like by institution? Is it by, gene? Is it by effort? Just a little more explanation on that.
So it is by, so there's a few ways. Civic typically organizes, has its organizations based on the institution that the members from, but for ClinGen Somatic, we have a ClinGen organization within Civic, and this is specifically based on our request. And all of the disease task forces and the expert panels are sub-organizations within the broader ClinGen organization within Civic. So you can look at all of the curations that are that have been done by curators within ClinGen, but also within other organizations like Washington University is one of the organizations, and others as well. All right, are there any other final questions? It looks like we have 1 more minute left.
There's also a help. You can always on the Civic, if you can always check the help sections, which are all of pretty easily located on the Civic webpage, and there are emails there to reach out to. There's help@civicdb.org, I think, and so those things. If you don't even have any notes from this meeting, you can just go to the website and rediscover all of this, as well as people to reach out to.
Thanks, Arpad. All right. Okay, there's a question about how can we log in. So when you go to actually, Jason, if you still have Civic on, could we like show everyone how
Yep.
to log into Civic one last time?
Sure. Make sure to actually share my screen this time instead of just doing it in the dark. All right, so if we're on the Civic homepage, is it being shared? Yeah.
Yes, we can see your screen.
So you go up to the top right corner and it says sign in or sign up. And then you have sign in with Google, you sign in with your Orchid, or you sign in with GitHub. So you basically have to create a username and profile on any one of these three particular areas and through these organizations. So you'd have to go through Google, Orchid, or GitHub to actually create a username. And then from there, that will link up with Civic. And once you create one of those, you can then select your particular choice, whether it's Google, GitHub, or Orchid, to actually sign in. That's the best way to do it. So create an account within one of those three, and then from those you can use those to link over into Civic, and then you're signed in. And once you're signed in, you're able to do and you can make additions, and you can make edits, and you can make comments within Civic then.
Great. Thanks, Arpa. It looks like this breakout room is going to close in a few seconds, so we'll see everyone in the lobby. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.